Welcome to a Men of His Word audio recording. Men of His Word is a conference that equips Christian men to take a leadership role within their family, congregation, and community. Go to menofhisword.org to find information on upcoming conferences and resources. This breakout session is entitled From Pastor's Kid to Police Officer. It was given in Oshkosh on February 17th, 2024. Jeff Engelbrecht is a consultant and trainer with Mighty Oak Active Threat Solutions, where he presents on the topics of civilian active threat response, situational awareness and de-escalation strategies, and house of worship, safety and security.
Let's start off with a little bit of heavenly humor, if we can, right? I'm going to tell you a tragic story. It gets, can we shut that? Yeah. It's a tragic story, but it gets better as the story progresses. There's an accident, a car accident. There's 3 ladies involved, and unfortunately they pass away in the car accident. And they go to heaven and they meet the Lord at the pearly gates. The Lord meets them at the pearly gates, and he says, "Ladies, welcome to heaven. So happy that you're here. Great to have you. I'm going to go through some ground rules with you before we enter." You'll notice that there's a lot of ducks inside heaven. It's one of my favorite creations. A lot of ducks. I love them. Do not step on a duck. If you step on a duck, there's going to be eternal consequences. Lord goes through the rest of the rules with the ladies, and they enter heaven. It doesn't take too long before the first lady steps on a duck. Lord appears, and with the Lord is the ugliest man she's ever seen. And the Lord says, "I'm sorry, I told you there'd be consequences if you stepped on a duck." He joined their hands together, and he said, "You two are together for eternity," and off they went, and she walked away. A short time later, the second lady stepped on a duck. She goes, "Oh." The Lord appears, and he says, "I told you there'd be consequences." And with him is a guy even uglier than the first guy. He joins their hands together and he says, "Sorry, I told you there'd be consequences. You're together for eternity." She walks away with him. Well, the third lady now is kind of walking on eggshells. She's trying to avoid ducks everywhere she can, but sooner or later, she steps on a duck. She goes, "Oh." The Lord appears, and with the Lord is the most handsome man she's ever seen. He's breathtaking, absolutely gorgeous. And the Lord joins their hands together, and she looks at him with tears rolling down her eyes, and she says, "I don't know what I could have possibly done to deserve this." He goes, "Yeah, I don't know. I stepped on a duck a few seconds ago right over there." So, again, my name is Jeff Engelbrecht. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. You have my bio. It's out there online, or if they have the handouts and things like that, so I won't go through that whole thing. I'll cut it down to kind of the short version of it. And that is, I've been a police officer for the last 28 years. I've been a police officer at a city north of here that hosts an NFL team that almost went to the Super Bowl this year unexpectedly, but didn't. I've been there my entire career. Out of that 28 years, 23 of those 28 years has been in a patrol function in some way, shape, or form. Either as a patrol officer, patrol supervisor, a field training officer, field training supervisor, a SWAT team member. So the majority of my career has been on the road, responding to calls and being with people who, quite honestly, are not probably having their best day, right? A little bit of time managing the training for the police department, a little bit of time as a public information officer, and I'm retiring this year. So I think a couple years ago, they decided to put me to pasture. They put me in an office upstairs, an administrative role, and I've been the emergency preparedness coordinator for the department for the last number of years. And what that job has entailed was I go out into the community and I speak to organizations such as businesses, large and small, hospitals, schools, churches, and talk about safety and security, emergency preparedness and planning, and active threat response, right? I also do that as a private consultant. I'll be doing that full-time when I retire from the police department. I work for a company called Mighty Oak Active Threat Solutions based out of Green Bay. We travel around the country and do corporate training for active threat response. We've added programs for situational awareness and de-escalation strategies, and now church safety and security programs as well. So that's the background. I have a wife, wonderful wife, Corey. My son, Jack, is 18, going off to Wisconsin Lutheran College next year. And my daughter, Lucy, is 15, going on 25 right now. So as we get started, I want to hand out some administrative assignments to help me run the presentation a little more efficiently. First assignment I normally give out is the official timekeeper. It's already taken care of. This gentleman over here has volunteered to raise his hand and throw something at me when it gets to be about 5 minutes left in the presentation, or 10 minutes. So I got that all taken care of. Don't throw a duck. Well, if you throw a duck at me, you're supposed to be careful not to step on it. The next assignment I hand out is a remote sensor. I'll walk around the room and I'll talk a little bit over here and I'll talk a little bit over there. And every once in a while, I'll take this thing and chuck it set it down and go over here and talk. And I find there's a direct correlation between the amount of gray I have in my beard and how often I forget where I set that thing down, right? So I need somebody to just kind of track that thing and watch it. And when you see a panicked look on my face, I just look to you. You're my anchor in the room, and you just point to wherever that is. So can I get a volunteer for that? Don't everybody speak at once. Bueller? Right in front. So Dan, if you could do that, please. I'll test you throughout the course of this, so make sure you're watching where this is going. And finally, the last thing I have up there, are there any first responders in here, police or fire, anything like that? A couple in here, great. You know what an IEP is, Incident Action Plan. You guys have dealt with that before, right? So most people haven't. I've dealt with IEPs that have been 60-plus pages. For special events that we do, we create them for Packer games and things like that. That's really the definition of it. You can read through that on your own. But I want to do a much scaled-down version of that for this session, for this presentation here, and just a verbal version of it. All right, so I want you to take a look around the room and just note where the exits are in this room in the event that we have to get out of here for some type of an emergency. Because most folks, before walking in here and noting that there's actually 4 exits here, probably all think the exit and the way to get out is what? Right there, the way that you came in. So just note there are other ways to get out of this room if we have to, okay? How many of you know where the nearest fire extinguisher is? There's one right here, right around the corner down the hallway here. So since, Tom, you're close, if we have a fire emergency and not the building burning down or anything like that, you're responsible for going and grabbing that piece of equipment and getting that back in here, okay? Okay. How many of you know where a defibrillator is, the closest one? It's right above the fire extinguisher in the hallway, right down here, right? So if we have a medical emergency in here, Jacob, if you could be in charge of running and getting that piece of equipment and getting that back in here. For my first responders in here, by show of hands again, CPR trained and certified, bunch of you guys, you'll be responsible for helping out with CPR for any type of an emergency with that, right? Anybody got a phone with them that knows exactly where we are? We know what hotel we're at. We know exactly what room we're in. Anyone? Yeah, in the back there. Your first name, sir? Jeremy. So you'll be responsible for calling 911 if we have an emergency like that, notifying the authorities what's going on, and then if you could go out and find where they're arriving and guide them into this area, all right? So do you see what we just did in the last 60 seconds? We did a little scaled down emergency action plan, incident action plan. And I ask you this as a rhetorical question. How many of you back in your congregations, whether you're an usher, greeter team, safety security member team, things like that, do things like that at the start of your service? Run through a little plan like that. Have a little safety huddle. That's what Festival Foods calls it with their people when they start their shift, right? They get together at the start of the shift and they talk about the little emergency planning that they do, right? So again, you don't have to answer that question, but just think about that because we're going to come full circle later on in the presentation and talk about church safety and security and talk a little bit about that being a part of it, okay? So as we get started, here is the roadmap that we're going to follow today. I'm going to start by talking about apprehension and motivation, all right? Sometimes I think there's apprehension to serve the Lord for various reasons, and then talk about the motivation that gets us over that apprehension. The next thing I'm going to talk about is service in a traditional sense, right? I equated service for my entire childhood and into my adult life in a traditional sense. Service to the Lord meaning the preaching and teaching ministry. That's all I knew growing up as a pastor's child. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about seeing the light, trusting God to place you where He needs you to be under those circumstances, right? And finally, we're going to close off with talking about coming full circle and talking a little bit about church safety and security. So when I'm talking about the foundation of service to the Lord, what are sometimes some apprehensions to that, you think? I can tell you right now I'm apprehensive. You want to know why? Because normally I get in front of a bunch of cops or fire folks or first responders, or I talk to civilians about police-related stuff that I'm used to, and it's easy, right? I'm just regurgitating stuff I've done 1,000 times. I'm talking about really a journey of faith here amongst you, right? A little bit my journey of faith, hoping that you pull some things from that you may be able to equate into your lives, right? But it's a little difficult for me. I'm outside my comfort zone, and here's why. I'm broken. I've fallen by the wayside on my journey of faith more than you can possibly imagine, right? It's a daily struggle for me, and my guess would be that other folks sitting in here, I can tell already by the head shaking that people are going, me too, brother, yeah, absolutely. So how do you overcome that, right? How do you overcome that apprehension to serve? Because we think we're broken. How can God use us? We're sinners, right? Well, the goal and the motivation and the key is the next line. What do I mean by that? Anybody in this room happen to know who that guy is? Probably not. There was one in the last session that did. It's my grandpa, the Reverend Floyd Maddock. That's his college picture from 1941. He passed away in 2012, and Grandpa was a very strict German Lutheran minister. He had congregations in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and then he served at congregations down in Texas as well. He had 10 kids, 5 boys, 5 girls, and he was a disciplinarian with his children and with his grandchildren. I can attest to the fact that he disciplined his grandchildren. All right, a very devout Christian man. All right, you didn't get away with anything with Grandpa. And when he passed away in 2012, I remember at his funeral, the funeral was up at Trinity Nina, and during the funeral processional, they started playing the processional hymn that he had picked. The hymn was Chief of Sinners Though I Be. And that blew me away as his grandkids sitting there, because here was this guy that I idolized, right? This strict German Lutheran minister who did no wrong, and what was he stating to the world? Not only am I a sinner, man, I'm the worst of the worst. That chief of sinners though I be. Right? So that apprehension as sinners, how can we serve? How can God love us? How can we do this? Right? To get over that, and that motivation is the next line. Chief of sinners though I be. Jesus shed his blood. Jesus shed his blood for me. And that's the motivation. Right? That's the motivation. That's the bond that we all share together. That's what allows us to be motivated. What he's done for us is what motivates us to serve him. Does that make sense? Right? We've got to have that foundation to start with before we talk about anything else. So, again, I'm talking about really my journey of faith here as a public servant and that roadmap and how that goes. And I'm hoping that, again, it's not about me per se. I just want you to be able to see some things and hopefully take some things away from that you can use in your life and see some similarities. Right? So my sense of service to the Lord really revolved around my perceptions growing up as a pastor's kid. That's my dad. And there's some photographs you can look at, and just by looking at the clothing, you can determine with about a 5-year range when that photograph was taken care of. And that happens to be one of them right there. That is definitely somewhere between 1975 and 1979, no doubt about it, based off of that slick jacket I got on there, right? That was his first church in St. Paul, Mankato, Minnesota. He was there for a couple years and then moved to Trinity Nina right up the road. He served the rest of his ministry there for 40-plus years. He's retired. He's not really retired. He's down in Oshkosh, actually preaching down here every weekend, helping out for one of the churches down here. But we moved to Trinity Nina. It's my sister and I during a basketball game at Trinity Nina, and a family photo later on. Now, it's the same way that you can gauge about a 5-year picture with clothing, you can do the same thing with hairstyles. All right, so when you look at the mullet, come on, you were probably there too at one time, right? Maybe not. And you look at the amount of Aquanet in the girl standing next to me, my sister, you know that's 1985 to 1989, no doubt about it, right? It's a late 80s picture. So, but again, most of my thought about service to the Lord was wrapped around the traditional sense, right? Preaching, teaching, because that's what I saw my whole life. I grew up in the church. The church was, the parsonage was connected to the church. That's all I saw was pastors and teachers and that whole part of it growing up, all right? So even though, for instance, I had an old crusty custodian named Reggie Fisher that was at our house every day, at the church every day from sunup till sundown, cleaning, doing an amazing job, taking care. I mean, he took care of that church and our house like you would not believe. I never equated that was beautiful service to the Lord, what he was doing right there, right? Because I saw it in a different sense. If you were serving the Lord, you were doing it through preaching and teaching. Well, eventually I went on to Fox Valley Lutheran High School. I graduated there in 1990. And during that spring semester, that gentleman right there, Brett, one of my friends, his dad passed away very suddenly in our spring semester. And that was kind of a wake-up call for me. It just showed me how quick life ended. And I wanted to do something, right? I had to do something as far as service was concerned. And what was my sense of service at that time? Traditional sense, right? If I was serving the Lord, I was going to do it through teaching and preaching. So I went off to, at that time, Dr. Martin Luther College. It's now MLC, Martin Luther College. So I spent my first year out there studying to be a teacher. And that was the first time that I heard the whisper. And I truly believe that when God is pointing you in a direction, he whispers to you, then he nudges you a little bit, and then he shoves you and gets you going in the right direction. I was sitting in Professor Raditz's history class, guy who I loved his class, loved the content of the class. That's where I heard the whisper that spring semester. And I just remember sitting in the class going, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. There's something else going on here. And I had a sense that I wanted to be involved in law enforcement. I didn't know why, but something was telling me that this was just not the right move for me. I shouldn't be here. So I left after that year and took a year off. Went to up the road here to University of Wisconsin in Oshkosh and finished my degree there and went on to the police academy. And on February 12th of 1996, I was sworn in as a police officer in Green Bay and have been there ever since. The course of that career has had a lot of amazing moments. Been very blessed to have been a public servant at the department. And these are stories that every first responder sitting in here can tell you. There's great things that you see in your career, right? I don't know what you guys do or how many years you've been doing it, but we get to kind of see a piece of life that most other folks aren't privy to and don't get to see, right? And there's some blessings that we see in the course of that. This is my swearing in with my mom and dad, my family, Corey, Jack, and Lucy. You wouldn't have memories as a Green Bay cop unless you had some picture somewhere of some Packer-related stuff, right? So there's pictures of Mark Murphy and Leroy Butler. And, I mean, I could tell you stories of sitting up till 5 o'clock in the morning with Brett Favre and Frankie Winters the night of Brett's first 7-year, however many $1 million contract extension, and talking to him about that while he had a chaw and his lip about that big as we were speaking, right? So there are a lot of great things. This is one that stands out. That little guy was in the back seat of Mom's car at Ashland and Mason up in Green Bay one morning on a Saturday morning when they were rear-ended by a drunk driver, and he was crushed in the back of the car. I can't tell you how many surgeries he went through. If you took that cap off, he's got that cap on because he's zippered from about here all the way up through here. We would go spend time with him. He was the most joyful little kid, never complained about a thing, had a beautiful recovery, always a smile on his face, and he was an inspiration. And I would bet that if I asked the other first responders in this room and other public servants, they would say the same thing. Yeah, we've had blessings and seen stories like that that have just touched our lives and made us appreciate why God has placed us here, right? There's also this, however. There's the bad, right? There's a lot of bad. This happens to be a little boy who lost his home at 2 o'clock in the morning to a fire in the freezing cold temperatures. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much other stuff, right? There's death notifications. There's fatalities. There's homicides, there's domestic violence, there's families destroyed by drugs and alcohol, things that we see every day. A lot of bad stuff. And then there's ugly, right? If you haven't picked up on it, I'm a Clint Eastwood fan, so I kind of use the theme of the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? This is an example of, this was my favorite restaurant in Green Bay until I was the first officer on the scene of a homicide, and I found the guy, the victim, in the back of the kitchen after he had been killed. I never stepped foot in there again after that. All right, there's a lot of ugly. All right, my other first responders in here, there's some ugly, isn't there, that you see. I'll relay another story to you. I could tell more and more. They could tell more and more, right? But I'm just going to relay one more to you. One afternoon at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I got a call for 3 kids outside of their house. They had done their same thing, their same routine they had done every day. They left to go to school. Mom sent them off. They got back home. They were 7, 9, and 11. And when they tried getting in the front door with the key, they couldn't. Door wouldn't open. So they went down to the basement and they sent the 7-year-old through the basement window because he was the only one small enough that could get through there. So he crawled through the basement window and he came up through the house. And when he got to the living room, he found out why they couldn't open the door. Mom sent them off to school that day and she took the sofa and barricaded the living room door. And she shot and killed herself in the living room. And that little 7-year-old boy found her there. And that little guy clung to my leg for about an hour after I got there that day. These guys probably have same stories, similar stories that they could tell you. There's a lot of ugly. And soon, that ugly started to take over for me, right? And it's not hard to have happen in public service, right? Not hard to let the ugly take over. And I viewed the world as kind of dark. In fact, a movie came out right about this time. You might recognize it. Anybody know the movie? Thank you, Gladiator. Anybody remember the scene? This is a scene of Maximus, the general, talking to Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, after a battle, and they're discussing the importance of Rome, the value of Rome. And Marcus Aurelius is questioning the value of Rome. And Maximus says, I got 10,000 of my soldiers dead in the field out there. I got another 5,000 that are bloodied and cleaved and will probably never make it home. I will not think that they died for nothing. I've seen the rest of the world. It's cold, it's dark, and it's brutal. Rome is the light. That's what he says. And I listened to that and I went, wow. Because you know what? I've seen the rest of the world. I've seen parts of the world that most folks aren't privy to, and some of us are. And it's cold, and it's dark, and it's brutal. And I wanted the light, Christ. Right? I didn't want to be part of this anymore. I wanted to be part of that light. So if I was going to do that and serve, what was my traditional sense of service? Out loud? Church, preaching and teaching. So I went back to my comfort zone, right? So I met with Pastor Parlow John Parlow, if you know him, up in Green Bay. Talked to him, and I said, I'm leaving the police department. I'm going to go into the ministry. And I met with Pastor Dolan, I think, who at the time was the admissions counselor for MLC for the pastoral studies. He was in Appleton. We met at the Paper Valley Hotel. We talked, and I said, I'm leaving. Talked about this movie, talked about everything that I just told you. And my plan was set. I was going to leave law enforcement and go into the ministry because I wanted to be part of the light. I didn't want to be part of this dark, cold, brutal world anymore. A couple days later, a co-worker of mine was involved in an officer-involved shooting. He shot and killed a guy justifiably. It made news, as it always does, in our communities. And a couple days later, I got a card, from a lady at St. Mark Church up in Green Bay. I opened it. I don't know who she is. I didn't recognize the name. I don't even know, really, to be honest, if she even exists to this day, right? I opened this card, and it had just very beautiful. It said, thank you for your service and everybody else's service in the Green Bay Police Department, so on and so forth. But she put a little card inside the card. And on the card, there was a Bible verse. And with that Bible verse, she hand-wrote a little note that said, wherever God has placed you right now in this moment, that is where he intends you to be and needs you to be. That was the shove, right? There was the whisper, there was a nudge, and that was the push, the shove. And I realized that maybe it isn't so much first responders and folks like us trying to leave and go towards that light and be part of that, as much as it is what? Take part of that light and bring it to that environment where he's placed you, right? Because there's work to be done there. Agreed? Yeah. So I stayed. And I saw a lot of, I'm so thankful that I did, that I remained there for the number of, after that time, so another 24 years after that or so, whatever it was. I saw a lot of great things happen at the department. Agree or disagree, there are a lot of folks, men and women serving as public servants in the police departments and fire departments that are Christ-centered individuals, right? And when you start seeing people at your departments that start talking about their faith, unhampered, right, and they start having conversations, and you start seeing how they act on calls and relating to people, it's a good thing to watch, isn't it? Right? It's a beautiful thing to see. The guy in our department, he's retired now, but very Christ-centered man, great faith. And he brought a program from the Kansas City Police Department to our department called the Unconditional Respect Initiative. You guys ever hear of it? So Kansas City PD started that off, right? And the point of that initiative is we train officers to treat every single individual with human dignity. I think Pastor Berg said something like that earlier in the opening session, right? To look at them as a person. Because sometimes when you go to call to call to call, from the bad to the ugly to the bad to the ugly, what can we end up doing to people? They're just objects, right? That program that he developed and trained at the Green Bay Police Department, he'll never tell you this. He'll never say it was a Christ-centered driven practice that he started there, but it was. Right? That's why he did it. All right. From that to having an officer pull up to another officer and park after a call and say, boss, can I ask you something? Why does God let bad things happen to good people? And now that person of faith shares that with that officer, right? And there's story after story about things like that as well, right? And I'll leave you with one more before I start to move to the next chapter. We start talking about church security and safety. And that is, I'm going to relay one call to you. And that is about 2 o'clock in the morning one night. It was a cold winter night. And I went to a domestic violence call. Been to 100 of them before that, 100 of them after that, right? And I go to this call and arrest this guy for domestic violence. And he fights, right? Not the most violent fight we've ever had, but he fights. We get him in custody, and he's doing this the entire time. Lighting me up, saying the most vile crap you could possibly imagine to me the entire time. And he's struggling in handcuffs all the way out to the car. I get him in the car, and I start heading to the jail. And he's screaming at me. He's spitting in the divider, right? And you've got the mucus thing hanging, dribbling down, behind you, and he's cussing at me and whatever else. Well, by this time, I had a new policy. My policy was I kept Christian radio on the entire time in the car, no matter what. The city could not make me turn that off. There was no way. I wasn't baptizing people in the Fox River, but I could do this, right? So we started heading to jail, and on the way out, he's screaming. Finally, he just had to come up for breath, ready to breathe, and he stopped for a second. He finally shut up for a little bit. And all I said was, Don, I'm going to pray for you tonight. And then he started screaming and yelling again and doing all that, right? So we get to the jail. I get him off to the jail. A year later, almost to the day, I get a call. Somebody reports a guy who's got a warrant at an address. So we go to pick him up at an apartment above a bar in Green Bay. And I walk in the room, and there's about 6, 7, 8 people seated there, and I figure out who the guy is that's got the warrant, and guess who it is? It's Don. And there's Don, right? I said, other officer actually next to me says, can you stand up and get a warrant out for your arrest? Yes, sir. Turns around and without a problem. I walk him out to my car because I get stuck with the transport. I don't know, because I was a junior officer probably at the time, right? So I walk this guy out to the car. I don't say a word to him. He doesn't say a word to me. Sits in the car, and we start heading out to the jail. And in my rear view, I'm watching, and he's just looking out the window, not saying a word. And finally, I say to him, I say, Don, you don't remember me, do you? He goes, oh, yeah. Yeah, I do. And so I'll tell you what, it's a little bit different demeanor now versus a year ago. And he goes, I haven't had a drink since that day. He said, and officer, I've been in church every Sunday since that day. He said, it isn't perfect. He said, but I'm trying to serve. I'm trying to help the church where I can. I'm struggling still, but yeah, things are better. Right now, that's not nothing about me. That's about the Lord's ability to take that light and allow somebody to put it in an environment where he's placed you, right? And we all have that capability in our vocations. And you first responders that are in here, you have that capability in your vocation as well, right? So, as we move on, like the latter portion of my career now, I go out and I speak to a lot of groups about active threat response and things like that. I talk to large corporations, small businesses, hospitals, schools, and now a lot of churches that I speak to, both in my duties as a police department and as well as private consulting. So it becomes abundantly clear. Now, we just had this happen again, right? We had something happen down in Houston just this last weekend at the mega church down there, right? They had a shooting down there. And people are definitely concerned about safety in their congregations. Agree or disagree? What's your feedback that you get from your folks, right, in your congregations? Yeah, they're concerned about it. Part of that is a problem with media, right? Because when this happens down in Texas, it's all you hear about for the next 4 or 5 days with any one of these types of incidents, whether it be a church or not. You hear about it, it's pumped out there in the media, and people think this is happening all over the place all the time. Right? The fact of the matter is, if you look at the FBI's 2022 data on active shooters in this country, how many happen in churches? There are 50 incidents, according to the FBI, that happened throughout the year in 2022, active shooter incidents. How many took place in churches? 2. 1 in California and 1 down in Alabama. Both of those were stopped by who? Not law enforcement. People in the church. 1 in Alabama was stopped by an 80-year-old retired Air Force investigator. Anybody see the booking photo of that suspect when he got booked in? That 80-year-old guy, I'm off tangent now, so that's all right. That 80-year-old guy saw this shooting happening, took the chair in front of him, flipped it over, and took it to the shooter, right? And not only did he do that, he took the gun from the shooter once he got it from him and started hitting him with the butt of the gun. When they booked this guy in, now this is the part of me, the angel on this side says, Jeff, don't talk about this. And the devil on this side goes, oh, yeah. He had it coming. You can talk about it, right? That 80-year-old guy stopped that. All the killing that was taking place there that day, right? But my point with that is this. Statistically speaking, something like that happening in your congregation is very, very unlikely, statistically speaking, right? Let me ask you this. How many of you, by show of hands, have car insurance? Car insurance, right? I do too. I've been driving for 35 plus years. I've been involved in 1 accident. It was on duty and it wasn't my fault. That's the Internal Affairs investigation said it was not my fault. Just so you guys understand, right? So the statistical likelihood of me being involved in a car accident is very, very what? Low. It's probably not going to happen. What do I do every month? I pay the premium. You know, I used to write it out, lick the stamps and all that. Now I just press the button and send it off electronically. We all do that, right? We pay the premium. Why? Even though statistically speaking, it probably isn't going to happen, we know that the consequences of not being prepared for an event like that are pretty great. We want to be prepared. So people can't be filled with anxiety, wondering when the church doors are going to open and this is going to happen, right? They just got to be prepared. You just got to pay the premium, right? And that's what you're all doing by being here today and having this discussion and having further training with it down the line, potentially, if you're not already, right? Does that make sense to everybody? We're just paying the premium. I almost had to, who was my clicker person? Yeah, I almost had to turn you, but I recovered. So I think there is a precedent out there, and I think that this is not anything new. Now, if we can all revert back to our youth. Now, My youth is different than some who are actually youthful that are here in the room, right? But I don't remember ever being in church and thinking about stuff like this. We just didn't. Right? It wasn't something we talked about back in the day. But people do now, don't they? My guess is you have people that seek you out in your jurisdictions and ask you about the same kind of stuff that we're talking about right now. Are you cops or firefighters? Medics, okay, right. Then you know those conversations are happening, right? So yeah, people are concerned about that. But look at this, read this. I won't do PowerPoint or death by PowerPoint. Read that on your own. Even the psalmist David, back in Psalm 122, 1-8, talks about peace and security in your houses of worship. Agree? Right? So those conversations happen. And let me ask you this. Do we need to enhance safety and security in our churches? Do we have to? And if we do, how do you do that without hampering the overall mission of the church? That becomes the big talk, the big discussion, right? A lot of the churches that I go to and I speak to, they haven't had that discussion. They haven't decided where that balance sits yet, right? Because on the one side you have safety, the mission of safety, and the other side you have the mission of the church. What's the mission of the church? Spread the gospel, fellowship, preach the love of God, right? Mission of security is close the doors, keep people away, look at everybody with, you know what I'm saying? Things like that, right? So how do you balance that? And if you don't have that conversation in your congregation within your church governing body or your pastors, elders, whatever the hierarchy of the church is, you got to kind of have that first. Because I've watched church groups get angry at each other because they haven't had those conversations and don't really understand where they're sitting. Because this group over here is saying, well, we need to have, cops hired for every service. And this group over here is going, well, why don't we just take the 5 guys we know have concealed carry permits and we'll just have them be part of a security team. And these folks over here go, we don't want guns in the church, right? We just want maybe some more ushers and greeters and maybe better training for them and more situational awareness. And unless that gets meshed out ahead of time and we figure out where that balance is, there's going to be some folks that are not quite right with the discussion. Does that make sense? Right, so, yeah.
Would you say that's a conversation for the congregation as a whole, or maybe
Generally, when I've been involved in the discussions, it's been a pastor and the church council, church governing board, whatever that. I don't make the rules, right? And sometimes, in the end, I go, look, I defer to the shepherd of the flock. Whatever the pastor says, that's their church, right? And I step back and I let them decide that. But then we have another discussion after that, right? So if they go, well, the scale is going to go here, we're going to have 5 armed people as part of our security team because we know these 5 guys are concealed carry holders. And I just go, okay, that's where you set your scale at. But let me ask you this. Have you talked about the legal responsibilities yet? Have you consulted with your attorney? Have you consulted with your insurance agent? Do you have policies that are going to cover this? Are you planned and prepared fiscally to train them monthly or better, document all that training and keep doing that because you're going to have to do that for litigation purposes. And a lot of times, nobody's even thought about that yet. All right, so I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying there has to be an initial discussion where people have come to the table and talk about that first. So, true story. I'm going to talk to you about a template that I use. It's called the SEEK concept. And I use it when I talk about training church staff. And it doesn't matter whether it's armed security or it's ushers and greeters or it's pastoral staff or it's custodial staff or Sunday school teachers. I kind of work off the same template, all right? And I'll tell you how this came about. I do a lot of presentations up in Green Bay, go and meet and talk to groups. And I was on my way to speak to a Hispanic outreach church group in Green Bay. A lot of times I have these things tripled up on my calendar so I don't miss anything. Well, guess what? This one I forgot about, right? So I went from flying out of the office. I'm flying across town to get there, and I went, Lord, help me. What am I going to talk about here? I'm not prepared. I know they had been having the discussion that we were just talking about here. And on my way there, on the radio, the announcer read that verse over the radio. So, can you read that for me, Peter?
But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given
unto you, right? And it kind of dawned on me, like, seek him first, the overall mission of the church, and all these other things will be given to you as well. And I kind of use that as a template from there to help teach this, right? So what that seek concept is simply this: scan, evaluate, engage, and keep communicating. All right, so I start by talking about That first S, scan. Anybody know the story about the two guys that were working the radar station in Pearl Harbor? Any history buffs in here know about this story? All right, so Elliot was the name of one of the last names of one of the guys there, and he's being trained. And radar was a new thing. The British had given it to us, and they're watching the radar, and all of a sudden, boop, all these blips pop up in the radar. And they call their commander's office, and he's not there right away. He calls them right back, and they say, hey, we got all this stuff on the radar. And he says, it's probably a bunch of B-17s flying in from San Francisco. Don't worry about it. So they kind of sit and they watch it for a few more minutes. The blips go away as the planes go into the mountains in Oahu, and they leave and go back to their base to have breakfast. That was about 7 a.m. Remember, right, about 7:58 a.m. is when the attack at Pearl Harbor kicked off, right? And I'm not saying that history would have been changed, the course of history had somebody listened to what they were telling them, but they had situational awareness, didn't they? They had situational awareness about almost an hour before the attack ever happened, right? So we need to have our radar turned on. And it doesn't matter whether you're an usher, greeter, security team member, safety team member, and I'll tell you this, if you're forming teams at your church, the medical personnel are probably the first one that you want to get established, because you're more likely to have a medical emergency in your church than you ever are to have some type of active threat taking place, right? So let's take this from the perspective of a usher, greeter, or pastor for that matter. Scan. I'm watching as people are coming in the church, and on my radar pops up a family that I don't recognize. Because a lot of us as ushers, greeters, what do we know? You know your folks, right? You know your peeps that are coming in and out. So I recognize somebody that comes in, and it's a family that I haven't seen before. It's on my radar, right? That might be a family that I want to go and talk to, right? Now, from the perspective of a safety team member, right now, I see a gentleman standing over in a certain part of the church, and as he's pacing back and forth, and his hands are clenched, his fists are clenched, and he's breathing heavily, that pops up on my radar, doesn't it, right? Now, if I got my face in my iPhone, and I'm not paying attention or doing my duties diligently, I don't get to see that, right? And a lot of times what I see in churches is this with regard to just the usher and greeter thing and just this whole portion of scanning. You'll have ushers and greeters that are by the entrance. The service will start. Then what happens to your ushers and greeters? They go sit down and go do something else. I'm not saying they got to be, the Karate Kid at the front door doing this the whole time, right? But have some eyes on what's going on there, so that if you pick up on something out here, before it gets to here, you've got situational awareness. Situational awareness allows you to react quicker and implement emergency action plans faster. Does that make sense to everybody? All right? And you don't got to be the ex-UFC champion to have that skill, okay? We picked up this over here, right? The guy pacing, doing things that came up on our radar. How about from a medical perspective? If I see people in the sanctuary while everybody's standing up that all of a sudden start doing this and looking in a certain direction, and I see somebody drop, that should be on my radar, shouldn't it? Medics, right? Yeah, okay. So those are just a couple examples of that scanning portion of this, right? Situational awareness, have your radar working. The next is evaluate what's taking place. If I'm that usher greeter and I see that family, or I'm that pastor that sees that family coming in and standing off to the side a little bit, I evaluate and I go, these are folks that are new members potentially. So I'm going to maybe go over and greet them and say hi and welcome them to the church, right? If I see this happening over here with the guy who's pacing and clenching his fists and breathing heavy, what's my evaluation of that? Somebody in distress? Somebody that I may need to use some type of de-escalation strategy to talk to them? Somebody at least that I have to do what? Be a little more careful with if I decide to engage them and go talk to them. Does that make sense? All right. From the medical perspective, I see that person drop. Let me ask you this. I see that person drop amongst this group here. What's my immediate thought is probably happening? Okay, everybody's saying heart attack and stroke, right? So for the EMS folks that are in here, let me ask you this. But now when I get there, so I've scanned, I've evaluated, I've gone to really engage. But in my evaluation as I'm getting there, I see that their fingers are clenched into their hands, they're locked up, and they're closed like this in their seizure, some type of maybe grand mal seizure, right? So your evaluation is different when you see that, right? You know how I learned that? I learned that at Miller Stadium. I was there for a Brewer game. My brother-in-law went down in front of thousands of people right outside the store there. And I thought immediately, what? I've been to 1,000 heart attacks before, right? So that's what I thought was happening, right? So I got in there, didn't even really look, and I started to try to open up his mouth to open up the airway. Well, he was having a grand mal seizure. And what don't you do with somebody who's having a grand mal seizure? Try to open up their mouth. He clenched on me like a muskie on a bobby bait, right? So he was locked on tight. And I'm struggling. I didn't know what was going on, right? And this gentle giant of a man walked up behind me as my kids are screaming and crying and people are watching. And he said, son, why don't you step out? Let me step in here. I mean, the guy's like about 6'6" and just huge. He was a surgeon from St. Luke's, like an ER surgeon or something like that, right? He evaluated things much more often in that realm than I had, right? His evaluation was different. But he had probably scanned, picked it up on his radar, evaluated, and now was moving in to help and do something, okay? Which gets us to the next phase, engage. So scan, evaluate, engage based off that evaluation. If I see that family that's standing off to the side, I'm an usher greeter. I've evaluated what this is. What's my next step? Morning.
Morning.
Welcome to church. Happy to have you here, right? People decide on their church environment, new church environments, in how many seconds? Right? Pastors in here, you know? Pastor Paulo says this all the time, but I forgot what the answer is. Yeah, like 8 seconds they decide on the welcomeness of the church and the warmth of the church, right? For this person standing over here, I engage them. What might I do? Maybe the same thing. Maybe I'm a little different. Maybe I do what? Have somebody with me, right? Maybe I do this. I have a bottle of water with me. So that I go, how you doing? Do you just want to? I give them that bottle of water. What do I do when I give them a bottle of water? It goes in which hand? Their dominant hand. Now their dominant hand is what? Tied up. It's tied up for a minute, right? And people under stress, right, in distress, what are they doing? What are they not doing properly? They're not breathing, right? And what are you forced to do when you start taking some water? Relaxing and breathing, right? And maybe now we start employing de-escalation strategies as we're talking to them and try to calm them down. That portion of engage may involve something totally different, right? Maybe we're the usher team and we see this over here. And we have some history that we know of there and we go, you know what? We're not even qualified to handle with this, right? So what's our engagement mean? And we get on the phone. And our engagement is we contact first responders and police to come there and assist. Does that make sense? Right? That's all based off of your scanning, your evaluation, and now your engagement. If I'm that medical personnel that see that happening over there, what do we mean by engage? Well, it might mean that we're going to assist and do some things. In that grand mal seizure case, what's our engagement mean? What's that?
Everybody out of the way.
Right. Right. Firemen would tell me that all the time on calls, right? We'd be like, all the cops would go, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Make room. Firemen would tell us, right? We'll just make room. What might somebody else be doing, especially if we have an incident action plan? Call 911. What might somebody else do? Who was given the task to go link up with the first responders and guide them into the crisis site? Did I assign that back here? Right. Does that make sense? And those things all happen quicker with more efficiency when you have what in place? An emergency action plan, an incident action plan. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. And the last part of that C concept, so it's scan, evaluate, engage, keep communicating. What do I mean by keep communicating? The example of the new member in church and their family. How do I keep communicating with them? Say it again? Share contact information. We have a welcome register right over here. We have a connect center right over here. I'm going to talk to the pastor, see if he'll come talk to you after church, so on and so forth, right? But we keep those lines of communication open. What about this guy over here who's pacing and in distress? Maybe it's de-escalation strategies, right? And we go into a whole course with that and talk to people about how to do that effectively. What if I'm on the phone with 911 because of this person? What do I mean by keep communicating? Stay in the line, right? Stay in the line and keep updating them with information. Make sense? How about the medical side of it? What do you mean by keep communicating?
Communicate with everybody around you.
Right. Telling people to move, assigning responsibilities, talking to the patient, whatever it may be, right? It's all part of that. Does that make sense how that template is really, again, you take what you like, you can can the rest, but there are certain parts of that where we can talk to our church staff, whatever their responsibility is, and just have kind of an overall template about how we respond to some of these emergencies in church. Okay? Questions about that at all? So, I said we'd come full circle on that beginning discussion about an incident action plan. How many of you in your congregations, no matter what role you're in, do something like that? At the start of the service, you talk about, if this happens, we'll do this. And a lot of times, I mean, it's no different. Most groups I speak to, it's crickets when I say that. There's nothing wrong with that, right? That's why everybody's here kind of talking about the topic, right? Yes, sir?
in our church, we're out of Green Bay, it's Comical, and there's nobody here from the congregation, so I wouldn't want to share it with somebody here. But there's a group of us that have our own understanding of what we individually do, because the church council, our present pastor, the one before, did not want to have a meeting to discuss the safety. They won't let us put cameras in and all those things, but there's individuals of us that have our own patterns of what we do if there be an incident. I've sat in the same place, same pew for over 50 years. And I have my protection plan of where I'm at, and I know where some of the other people sit with their action plan, and where the ushers their action plan. But it's never discussed as a group other than once in a while if we're doing a project and we do it. But we have, and like here, it's the fourth session today. Every place I go, I cover that door. I don't care if it's a church meeting, I don't care if it's here, I don't care if it's at a restaurant, I don't care where it's at, I protect that door. I'm not carrying, I stopped carrying after I took the courses to realize it was too much responsibility, so I don't carry. But I do park my car very strategically in the parking lot, and I do some things that I feel safe. When I ordered the new pews for our church, I was on the board and we made sure that we had 1.5 inch thick solid oak pews with a 4 inch, 2.5 inch collar on the top. And it gives you an excellent place to exit height. And but there is a lot it's not only in church, but it's wherever you're at. I saw 3 or 4 people walk in here after me, and I just constantly have to. There's some other reasons in my life why I have to watch those things, and people have to be vigilant, whether you're in a grocery store or you're just driving in your car. If you're not prepared, my truck's prepared. I mean, I feel safe in my truck.
Yeah, and I think, you know what, Harold, I think we're going to recruit you and bring you over to my congregation. You can. I think we want you. Right, so even if it's a point of personal preparation, right? Yeah. Personal incident action planning. Look, I sit in the church during services. And what's that?
Near an exit.
I sit near an exit. You know, I do the typical thing. All cops will tell you. At a restaurant, I sit with my back to the wall. My kids know where to go. My kids are with me. They don't stand my gun side. All that kind of stuff, right? All that kind of stuff. But what I do guard against sometimes is this, and this wasn't part of the presentation, but I want to comment a little bit on what Harold brought up, is I do find myself sitting in services sometimes, and I'll be thinking about what Harold said. If this happens, what am I going to do? But what I try to do is not let that affect what? My worship. And I would say that even to the point of if you're to the point where you're assigning duties and you're having ushers and greeters that might have more training, or maybe you have a security team that's in place and things like that, if that's their duty, then that's what they're doing there that day. Because you can't worship the way you should to the Lord and give him your whole heart and mind when you are doing this. Right? Does that make sense to everybody? And it really, right? It's the same way I play in the band in church also, right? And Pastor Parlow, God bless him, he'll always come up to me when I'm playing in the band, and he'll go, "All right, you carrying? You doing this or whatever else?" I'm like, "Pastor, I can't." Right? I'll hit him over the head with a bass guitar, but that's about it, right? I got to be focused on my worship, right? So when you have people that are doing those tasks, make sure that you got a rotation so that people are assigned that task, but they have another service opportunity to dedicate to the Lord, right? And again, back to the point, Harold's spot on. We can take this outside of the context of the church and use it in our everyday lives, right? And have those discussions with friends and family and have a plan. And we're not talking about, bringing in SEAL Team 6 and training your congregation and doing things like that. But how do you get folks in your congregation and your team members, whether it be greeters, ushers, safety team members, custodial staff, Sunday school staff, how do you get them to start thinking about this stuff without doing the, let's go shoot paintballs around and have you run everywhere? Well, maybe remember this guy? Sully, Sullenberger, right? What's his claim to fame? Miracle Landing on the Hudson. Read what he says there. And really, in a nutshell, what he's saying is, folks don't just all of a sudden rise to the occasion most of the time, right? Under high stress and danger, what happens to the brain? That thinking person's brain in the front part, the prefrontal cortex, it shuts down. And a different part of the brain begins to take over. We call it the lizard brain, right? The animal brain. And you've got to pre-program that part of the brain to react quickly under high stress and danger, right? And what he's saying here is that he believes a lot of folks have done exactly what Harold just mentioned, right? They thought about it. They went through what they would do in a crisis and under stress. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So how can we start that in our congregations? Well, maybe within that governing board, thank you, within that church board with the pastor and whoever else, start asking these questions. How can you implement that plan? And it could be as simple as the three of us are ushers today. Well, what did I do at the start of the class today? Where's that? Where's this? I've done that for our team, for greeter teams at our church. And I've gone, okay, where's the defibrillator? And I've had 3 people go, I don't know. I have no idea. Let's just talk about it, right? And be aware of it. How can the church become more familiar with evacuation plans? Do you pull a fire drill and have everybody run out during the middle of the sermon? No, you can't do that. But you can do the flight attendant drill, right? Maybe once a month, once every other month. Remind the folks at the church. Just remember, we have exits here, here, and here. Right? I was consulting with a church last week, and I was with the governing board, and we were walking through the back behind the altar in the church back there. There's 2 exits there. And the governing board, as we're walking through, they went, we had no idea. We didn't know you get out back here, right? Because if they don't know that there's exits there, which way are they going when the crisis happens? Right to the front door, and that may not be where they need to go. That make sense? What options do you have to secure your church? This is a big one to me, right? How do you rapidly lock down your church? Because we've had crises that have happened where it began where? Not in the church, but where? In the parking lot, in the business across the street. And if you've got the radar working and you're scanning, you can pick the blips up on the outside of the radar and can communicate what's taking place, you can stop it ever getting inside there, or at least alert people to what the danger is coming. Make sense? All right. What are some options that you have to communicate with staff members? Radio communications, verbal, whatever it may be, right? Some folks go, I don't want to have radio pieces in ears and things like that, right? But if you got people that are out in the parking lot taking care of stuff, and your other people are on the other side of the church, how do you communicate information rapidly to pass on to them? And it may be simply, whatever it may be, but you got to be able to communicate that. So finally, as we wrap up here, I talk about some scary stuff, but this is always the comfort to me that I like to end with. All right. When we talk about these types of things, emergency preparedness and planning, this is the comfort to me one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most powerful verses in the Bible. All right. For I'm convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels nor demons, neither the powers nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation. And what I think the Apostle Paul is saying there is he's like, nothing. There's nothing out there, right, that God can't cover. And in the end, remember the next line, right? That's our motivation. Questions, comments, cares, concerns. I realize I'm right at time, so yes, sir.
I have met I have met at least one really bad police officer. And I'm an attorney, so don't take this.
No, I've met some really bad attorneys, so don't worry.
I get bad in industries and stuff like that, but, are you concerned that, so I guess from my perspective, it's awesome to have Christians in the police force because that darkness that you talk about, when they see it, they get overcome. I mean, one police officer I talked to was bragging about how in domestic violence cases they take advantage of the victim after they pulled the abuser out because she was vulnerable. And this is like slums of New York and New Jersey. And that's dark, sick and dark.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're getting pushed out with stuff. Why aren't you still, ministering and bringing the light of Christ into these police forces to keep us, I'm nervous that the police forces, especially Madison, godless, they're going to be dark and stuff. So where's that?
Yeah, I'll tell you, what's your first name?
Colin.
I'm worried about the world in general, dark and things like that. But this is what when I think about the dark and the cold world and things like that, I go, you know what? And I get your point completely. And we have some wonderful church chaplains that were in some of the other sessions that I was in that do that, right? And they minister to their folks. I do it where I can. We all have a responsibility within where God has placed us to share that light with whoever it is. I don't know if you heard me. I know bad attorneys, right? So wherever we are, wherever God has put us, right, there are broken people, ourselves included, and we share that with him no matter what the vocation is. And I think that what I was getting at was where I see the media and about how dark the world is and how terrible it is, then I see stories about a college campus down south where they baptized like 2,000 people at one time. And I see other stories where there's revivals going on where there's 60,000 people in a stadium. And I watch a stadium with Chris Tomlin singing and the stadium filled singing praises to God. And I'm almost in tears. And I go, you know what? It reminds me of this. It reminds me of Abraham standing up there with God going, if there's just 5, will you spare the city? If there's just 10, will you spare the city? I think there's a lot more out there than we realize. I think there's a lot of people within this country and within this world that the light of Christ is running pretty good, right? So don't lose despair. We'll keep working within the police force, and you and I will be working with that, right? And everybody will be spreading the light of Christ within their vocation and everything like that. But I don't think sometimes when we talk about the world being dark and whatever else, that light's out there, and it's permeating a lot more, I think, than we think. Hopefully that adds something to your question there. Anybody else?
I just have one, be aware of your health professionals that are in church. A couple of times, as we have our ushers, we know we have several first responders, and we've had incidents where we just go down, tap them on the shoulders.
Yep.
They get up and they help.
Yeah, again, if I had medical people that I identify in my church, I want them as some of the first people that I put on a team, right, and make sure that they're
be aware of
they know where they are.
Where they are. Okay.
Yep, exactly. Great point. Anybody else? Thank you to my fellow first responders in the back here, my EMS folks. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.
If you found this useful, the greatest gift you can give us is to pass it on to a friend. These recordings are free because of the support of our donors and sponsors. To visit our sponsors, to donate or to volunteer or to find more recordings, go to menofhisword.org. James and Timothy Rudat helped record and edit these episodes, and I am John Rudat, the technical manager for Men of His Word.